You're walking alone at night and you see a figure in the distance. Your body tenses. You slow down or change your route. Then you get closer and realize it's a mailbox, a bush, something completely harmless. The fear was real even though the threat wasn't. Your mind filled in details that didn't exist. It saw intention, danger, movement where there was none. This happens constantly, just less dramatically. You glance at someone's face and think they're angry. Later you find out they were just tired or distracted, not upset at all. You read a text message and hear a tone that the sender never intended. You assume someone didn't respond because they're avoiding you when really they just got busy and forgot. In each case, your mind added information that wasn't there. Most people recognize this when it's pointed out, but they don't realize how automatic it is. We think we see reality and then interpret it, but that's not how it works. The interpretation happens instantly, before conscious thought. By the time you're aware of what you're seeing, your brain has already decided what it means. The raw data and the story about the data arrive together, and you experience them as the same thing. This creates a strange problem. You can't always trust your perception because your perception isn't neutral. It's shaped by what you expect, what you fear, what you've experienced before, what you're focused on. Two people can look at the same situation and see completely different things, not because one is lying or mistaken, but because their brains are filling in different blanks based on different histories. What makes this tricky is that the false additions feel as real as the actual information. When you see threat in the mailbox, you don't experience it as a guess. You experience it as perception. The correction only comes later when more data arrives. Until then, you're operating on a version of reality that your mind constructed, and you have no way of knowing which parts are real and which parts are added. That gap between what's there and what you see is where most misunderstandings live. The brain is a prediction machine. It's constantly guessing what's about to happen based on what usually happens. That's efficient. If you had to consciously process every piece of sensory information before acting, you'd be too slow to function. So the brain takes shortcuts. It uses past experience to fill in missing information, to complete patterns, to jump to conclusions that are probably right. The key word is probably. Most of the time these predictions are accurate enough. You see part of a face and your brain fills in the rest. You hear the beginning of a sentence and you already know where it's going. You walk into a room and instantly understand the social dynamics without analyzing every detail. This works because the world is mostly consistent. Faces have predictable structures. Conversations follow patterns. Social situations repeat. But the brain doesn't distinguish between actual perception and predicted perception. When it fills in a gap, it presents that guess to your conscious mind as if it's real information. You don't see a blurry shape that might be a mailbox or might be a person. You see a person. The uncertainty happens underneath awareness. By the time you're consciously experiencing it, the brain has already committed to an interpretation. This is why eyewitness testimony is unreliable. People genuinely remember seeing things that never happened because their brain filled in details to make the memory coherent. The memory feels real because the brain doesn't tag it as constructed. It just integrates the prediction with the actual data and stores it as one seamless experience. Later, you can't separate what you actually saw from what your brain assumed must have been there. The predictions are based on prior experience, which means they're biased toward the familiar. If you've been in situations where people were hostile, your brain is more likely to interpret ambiguous expressions as hostile. If you've been betrayed before, you're more sensitive to signs of dishonesty, even when they're not there. The brain isn't trying to be accurate. It's trying to keep you safe, and sometimes that means erring on the side of seeing danger that doesn't exist. This also happens with positive expectations. If you like someone, your brain fills in their ambiguous actions with positive intent. You overlook contradictions, excuse behavior you'd criticize in someone else, see evidence of care that might not be there. The mechanism is the same. The brain is completing a pattern based on what it expects, and what it expects is influenced by what it wants or fears. That's not conscious manipulation. It's automatic processing that happens before you have a chance to question it. The problem compounds when you act on these filled-in perceptions. You respond to the anger you thought you saw, which creates actual tension. You withdraw from the person you assumed was avoiding you, which damages the relationship. You make decisions based on threats or opportunities that only existed in your interpretation. Now you're not just seeing things that aren't there. You're creating real consequences from false perceptions, which then reinforces the original pattern. The brain predicted hostility, you acted defensively, the other person responded with actual hostility, and now your brain files that as confirmation that it was right all along. The first step is noticing the difference between observation and interpretation. Observation is what a camera would record. Interpretation is the story you tell about what the camera recorded. Someone doesn't reply to your message. That's observation. They're ignoring me is interpretation. Their face looks tense. That's observation. They're angry at me is interpretation. The distinction seems obvious when laid out like this, but in real time they're fused together. Slowing down helps. When you feel a strong reaction to something, that's usually a sign that your brain has filled in information. The reaction is to the interpreted version, not the bare facts. If you pause and ask what you actually know versus what you're assuming, you start to see the gap. You actually know they didn't reply. You're assuming it means something about their feelings toward you. Those are different categories of information. This doesn't mean your interpretations are always wrong. Sometimes they're accurate. But treating them as definite when they're actually provisional changes how you respond. If you're certain someone is angry, you get defensive. If you recognize you're not sure, you might ask. That one shift, from certainty to uncertainty, opens up options. You're no longer reacting to a fixed reality. You're working with incomplete information and trying to gather more before deciding what it means. What you'll notice when you practice this is how often your initial interpretation was incomplete or wrong. Not always, but enough to make you more cautious about trusting it. Someone's tone that seemed dismissive was actually just them being distracted. The criticism you thought you heard in their words wasn't there when you reread the message. The pattern you were sure you saw turned out to be coincidence. Each time this happens, it loosens the grip of automatic interpretation. You become more comfortable with not knowing immediately. This is especially important in relationships. Most conflicts aren't about what actually happened. They're about what each person thought happened. One person feels attacked by something that wasn't meant as an attack. The other person feels misunderstood because their intent was different from how it was received. Both are responding to their own filled-in versions of the interaction, and those versions don't match. If neither person can step back and recognize that they might be seeing something that isn't there, the conflict just escalates. The skill isn't eliminating interpretation. You can't do that. The brain will keep filling in gaps because that's how it works. The skill is holding your interpretations lightly, recognizing them as working theories rather than facts. That small shift in how you relate to your own perceptions makes you less reactive, more curious, better at navigating situations where the full picture isn't clear. It makes you someone who checks their assumptions instead of acting on them blindly. You'll never have complete information about anything. There's always something you're not seeing, something you're filling in without realizing it. That's not a problem to solve. It's a condition to accept. The question is whether you operate knowing that or whether you pretend your perception is complete. People who pretend their perception is complete become rigid. They're certain about things they shouldn't be certain about. They double down when challenged because admitting they might be wrong means admitting they've been operating on incomplete information, and that's uncomfortable. It's easier to defend the interpretation than to question it. But that rigidity creates problems. It leads to unnecessary conflicts, missed opportunities, relationships damaged by misunderstandings that could have been cleared up with a single question. The alternative isn't doubt about everything. It's calibrated confidence. You trust your perceptions when they're based on clear, repeated evidence. You hold them loosely when they're based on ambiguous signals or limited data. You stay curious about the gap between what you think you see and what might actually be there. That doesn't make you indecisive. It makes you accurate. You're working with reality instead of your brain's best guess about reality. What changes when you do this is how you relate to being wrong. It stops feeling like a failure and starts feeling like an update. Of course you were wrong. You were working with partial information and your brain filled in the rest. Now you have more data and you can adjust. That's normal. That's how learning works. The only people who are never wrong are people who never update their interpretations, and they're wrong more often than anyone, they just don't realize it. This also changes how you relate to other people's perceptions. When someone sees something you don't see, instead of assuming they're mistaken or dishonest, you recognize they might be filling in different gaps based on different experiences. That doesn't mean both interpretations are equally valid, but it means there's usually something to understand about why they see it that way. That understanding doesn't require agreeing. It just requires acknowledging that perception is constructed, not given, and different people construct differently. The mind sees what isn't there because that's what minds do. They complete patterns, fill in blanks, predict based on history. Most of the time it works well enough. But well enough isn't the same as accurate. There's always a layer of interpretation between you and reality. Recognizing that layer, learning to distinguish it from the actual data, holding your interpretations as provisional rather than certain, those are skills that change how you move through the world. You become less sure and more accurate at the same time. That's not a contradiction. That's wisdom.